The 2017 epic historical war film Dunkirk depicts the Dunkirk evacuation of World War II from the perspectives of land, sea and air. But as entertaining as this movie is, how true to history is it? To start with, the characters and the storyline they follow are fictional. Commander Bolton is a composite of several real men, including real Commander James Campbell Coulson, which the lack of an actual depiction of Coulson drew fair criticism, and attention was drawn to honour him for his role in the evacuation. Dawson is inspired by Charles Lightoller, a survivor of the Titanic. The character of Collins is parallel to the experiences of Spitfire pilot Jack Potter, with Collins' ditching partly inspired by that of Eric Barwell in his Defiant. Some media outlets suggested Farrier was inspired by Alan Deary. The film portrays the evacuation generally realistically in comparison to the historical event. It accurately portrays a few Royal Air Force aeroplanes dogfighting the Luftwaffe over the sea, limited to 1 hour of operation by their fuel capacity. The combat, however, is portrayed at a much lower altitude than in reality. Destroyers and fighter aircraft were indeed held back from battle, as the Royal Navy and Air Force would have been the sole defenders against invasion. There was indeed a temporary withdrawal of destroyers during the early stages after considerable losses. However, an appeal to the Admiralty by Admiral Ramsay reversed that decision. Also worth pointing out is the accurate depictions of how a small boat evaded aerial attack, and of how soldiers returned to England saw a civilian population largely unaware or unaffected by the war. British officers did initially refuse to evacuate French soldiers, although Churchill later insisted that the French be evacuated alongside the British. The realism of the film was acknowledged by Dunkirk veterans, although one said that some thought it was louder than the actual battle. Another point is that the beaches seem almost empty at certain moments in the movie, whereas in reality they were packed with men and equipment. Also, when the beach scenes were shot, the weather was worse than during the real evacuation. Other minor differences that veterans have pointed out is that in one scene a non-commissioned officer gives a salute without wearing his military beret, which was inaccurate protocol. Noses of German planes were not actually painted yellow until after the evacuation. This was done to differentiate the German planes. Contemporary shots were used for aerial views of the town, whereas Dunkirk was in ruins by the time of the evacuation. The design of the airborne leaflet propaganda was similar to those used in 1940, although the originals were not in colour. The real evacuation of Dunkirk took place between 26th of March and the 4th of June 1940, when more than 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the nearby beaches on the northern coast of France. Naval vessels and hundreds of civilian boats were used in the rescue, and it became one of the most celebrated episodes of the Second World War. The German Blitzkrieg swept through Belgium and into France, and the situation quickly became indefensible for the Allied troops defending the region. And so, on the 26th of May 1940, the British forces stationed in France were given the order to fight back to the west. This began a series of engagements as the Allied forces began a fighting retreat towards the coast. Planning for the evacuation began on the 20th of May 1940, and British forces were ordered to make their way to Dunkirk shortly after. By the 29th of May, a perimeter around Dunkirk had been established. Trapped between advancing German troops and the sea, the BEF was in a dangerous position. The Royal Navy began the evacuation of Dunkirk, codenamed Operation Dynamo, late on the 26th of May. So great was the task that a makeshift fleet of civilian ships was sent to assist: trawlers, passenger ferries, yachts, pleasure steamers, and hundreds of other private crafts. The defenders fought desperately to allow time for the evacuation fleet to complete the evacuation. Despite the desperate defence, German forces broke into the town on the 1st of June, but the stalwart defence meant that the evacuations could continue, despite the harassing artillery fire and Luftwaffe bombing runs. The harbour at Dunkirk quickly became unusable, thanks to the attention of German artillery and bombs. Without access to the docks, the troops were taken directly off the beach by small boats, or they embarked on larger boats via stone and concrete breakwaters, called the East and West Moles. Under heavy attacks on all sides, many vessels were sunk or badly damaged, including 9 destroyers. By the 4th of June, about 200 vessels had been sunk, and RAF Fighter Command had lost more than 100 aircraft. Fighting continued until the last moments, with French troops remaining behind to safeguard, the last to leave. By the time Dunkirk fell, more than 338,000 men had been rescued, including 140,000 Allied soldiers. Many British and Allied forces fought on in France, and troops continued to be evacuated from the western coast until the day of the French surrender on the 25th of June. However, not everyone could be evacuated at Dunkirk, with around 40,000 men reported to have been captured or forced to surrender during the retreat to the coast and during the evacuation itself. Losses were more than 68,000 killed, wounded, or taken as prisoners of war. Thousands of men were separated from their units in the confusion of the fighting and the withdrawal, and it was impossible to establish exactly where or when many had died. Some were buried where they fell hastily, by comrades at the roadsides or in a field, and their graves later lost. Others did not find their final resting place till long after the fighting was over. Much of the British Army's supplies, equipment and vehicles lay abandoned in the fields and beaches of northern France, in what can only be described as an emphatic German victory. Shortly after the evacuation was complete, Winston Churchill addressed Parliament with these words: "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributions of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, but there was a victory inside this deliverance, which should be noted." The evacuation of Dunkirk was not the total disaster expected by the British High Command. Even the most generous estimates had suggested that only 30,000 men would be rescued, but the eventual total was more than 10 times that. Owing to the bravery of all those that had been involved in the evacuation, more than 330,000 troops had been evacuated from France, living to fight another day.